In this talk, we're going to examine an issue that cuts to the heart of what is holding evolutionary psychology back from its full potential. Although evolutionary psychology is beginning to be embraced by substantial swaths of the scientific community, it is still fundamentally being misunderstood. This misunderstanding represents an existential threat to evolutionary psychology's continued viability, and it's actively hurting our ability to make progress as a scientific community. This misunderstanding does not stem from the evolutionary part, even though that has been controversial, but rather from the psychology part of the approach. What we're going to do in this talk is use an existing debate, what has come to be known as the modularity debate or the massive modularity debate, between mainstream psychologists on the one hand and evolutionary psychologists on the other, to draw out this misunderstanding. We'll consider an alternative framework for thinking about this debate and for thinking about and describing the psychological claims of evolutionary psychology in general. This debate has been weird and exasperating, especially for evolutionary psychologists. Here roughly is how it's gone over the past 40 years. Evolutionary psychologists say, hey, there's evolved modules in the mind. The response is, modules? Yes, modules. Do you mean by modules Fodorian modules? No, we don't. Great, what do you mean then? We mean functionally specialized systems. Oh, so you mean Fodorian modules. So what is Fodorian modularity, given that it's been projected onto evolutionary psychology? There's a philosopher of mind named Fodor. He was a funny guy, but a grumpy guy. And he made the claim that the mind contained these things called modules that existed out in the periphery. For example, things like visual input analysis, acoustic input analysis. And he argued that all of these modules have the following attributes. Informationally encapsulated, meaning they have access to less than all that the organism knows, that they're automatic, they happen without conscious activation or awareness, they're fast, domain-specific, fixed neural architecture, characteristic development and breakdown, and have shallow outputs. Now for Fodor, the most important attribute far and away was information encapsulation. But for some people, automaticity also falls under this category. And in both cases, a nice example of this is something like visual illusion, where you might know that the two horizontal lines are in fact the same, but because of the way your visual system works, you can't help but see them as being different. Now, what about evolutionary psychologists and their claims about mental modularity? Well, people like Lee Cosmides, John Tooby, Don Simons, David Buss, and more recently Rob Kurzban, Clark Barrett, David Frederick, and Marty Hazelton, along with Ed Hagen, have all been really clear about what they mean by modularity, which is just that the mind is not composed of modules just in the periphery, but it's modules everywhere. The mind is more or less exclusively composed of modules. And modules in this case have a particular set of attributes. They're functionally specialized, meaning that they can be functionally isolatable from one another, and their characteristics are not Fodorian, but rather specific to the adaptive problem that they're for. As Clark Barrett puts it in his recent book, the central mantra of adaptationism is it depends, meaning form follows function. Now, one cannot overstate how effusively evolutionary psychologists in the past have pointed out that they do not mean by their version of modularity Fodorian modularity. Furthermore, as they rightly point out, Fodor is a historical anomaly. Notions of distinct faculties or function within biological systems can be traced back at least to the 2nd century writings of Galen on physiology, with the German neuroanatomist Gall in the 19th century, and modularity proper in developmental biology in the 30s with Needham, and in descriptions of information processing systems with Herbert Simon in the 1960s. All of these accord much more with EP's version of modularity than Fodor's, which is roughly that modules are hierarchically arranged units of causal interaction where there is more within unit causal interaction than between unit causal interaction. Now, this difference between Fodorian and evolutionary modularity makes the projection of Fodorian modularity onto evolutionary psychology all the more puzzling and exasperating. And it's not just projection. It's also been accompanied by an active willingness to ignore or even disagree with evolutionary psychologists about what evolutionary psychologists themselves are claiming about what evolutionary psychology says. So a really good example of this is a back and forth between Disteno et al. And Barrett et al. On the nature of sexual jealousy mechanisms and their automaticity. And a very quick snippet of that back and forth, Barrett et al. Say, look, evolutionary psychologists have been explicit about what they mean by modularity, and this does not include a commitment to automaticity. See, for example, et cetera, et cetera. And Disteno and I'll respond, we completely disagree that one can define a module without invoking some type of automaticity. At minimum, we assert that ECMs of all cognitive modules must be able to be initiated without conscious intention. This is like disagreeing with Sue about what Sue thinks about some idea. It's just an argument by assertion, where the grounds of the assertion seem at best unjustified. So what's going on here? Why are waves and waves of ink being spilled on the quote-unquote massive modularity debate without any resolution? Why can't we convince people by modularity we mean functional specialization? Why are we being ignored? And so our claim and argument is presented in this paper, Why Evolutionary Psychology Should Abandon Modularity, and everything I'm about to say can be found in fuller, more detailed treatment within this paper. It's available on PsycArchive and will be in press later this year in Perspectives on Psychological Science. So what's the argument? So until now, the modularity debate has seemed to be a debate about the same object, module, and the different sides just happen to disagree about how many of these things there are and their attributes. But it's our contention that this is wrong, that the two sides in the modularity debate are not only not talking about the same entity, they're not even approaching the mind at the same level of description, or as we will call it, the same level of analysis. Now, to preview what this means is that the critics of evolutionary psychology are wrong about projecting Fodorian modularity onto EP, but it's not crazy or unjustified. This is good, though, because it means that if we identify the deeper reason for why they're doing this, we can do something about it. It also means that we can't just blame Fodor for the misunderstanding of modularity. We're going to argue that Fodor is just a symptom, a tip of the iceberg of a deeper, more fundamental problem for people, particularly scientists, thinking about the mind. So here's the most important point. Our claim is that you can't understand the modularity debate without the concept of levels of analysis. And not only for understanding the debate, but for also finally killing it and moving beyond it. So what do we mean by levels of analysis? Well, consider an ice cream cone. You can describe it in terms of its taste, vanilla, its chemistry, which in this case would be a vanillin, and its physics, such as this atomic and subatomic particles that interact to make up the ice cream cone. Now, each of these descriptions exists at a different level of analysis or reduction. The top level is least reductive, the bottom level is most reductive. Each level contains different entities and rules of causation. What philosophers would say is that these constitute distinct ontologies. For example, it would be weird to think that the taste of vanilla could somehow bump into a vanillin molecule. We understand that the taste and the chemistry are different ways of describing the same thing, but the taste and the chemistry do not causally interact with one another on the same playing field. And what's true for ice cream cones is also true of the mind. Following Dennett and others, we argue that there are three different levels of analysis at which the mind can be approached and described. These are the intentional, functional, and implementational levels of analysis. These roughly correspond to treating the mind as an agency, as a robotic mechanism, or as a pile of flesh. The intentional level of analysis is the default ontology that most humans use when thinking about themselves or other people, and is studied under various names, including theory of mind and psychological essentialism. And it corresponds to what Dan Dennett has called taking the intentional stance. This level features things like our first-person phenomenology, the experience of a you or I or me sitting inside of our skulls and thinking and reasoning and making decisions. We'll refer to this agency in the mind as the central agency, which in turn then interfaces with everything else. For example, you could lose your arm and still not lose your sense of view, or you could have trouble recalling a memory, which means that for the time being, that memory is outside the scope of you. You can't get to it, and so on. So at this level, everything else is the stuff that the you or I is separate from, which could include other parts of the mind and other parts of the body. This interface between the central agency and everything else is where what philosophers would call interactionism happens. The next level down is the functional level of analysis. This level is purely mechanistic, meaning that only mechanisms exist. There is no you or I or central agency anywhere in the mind at this level. Instead, the mind works via the execution of mechanisms carrying out their functions. It's a vast society of little blind demons. This level corresponds to what Dan Dennett has called taking the design stance. And at this level, the mind is exclusively composed of input, processing, and output systems that can be described at various levels of abstractions. And we can think of this level in the same way that we might think about a software level description of a control system in a robot. Namely, we're describing a set of abstract rules of causation or contingencies. Importantly, also, whatever we mean by the central agency at the higher intentional level of analysis, at this functional level corresponds to just a bunch of different mechanisms. Finally, the third and most reductive level is the implementational level of analysis. This features physically locatable entities such as physical brain regions, neurons, electrochemical processes, and so on. This level corresponds to what Dan Dennett has called taking the physical stance, and it's at this level that we capture, for example, what nerve cells look like, or might describe how light hitting rhodopsin molecules and photoreceptors in the eye produces electrochemical excitation and so on. So basically, this level is describing the physical wiring of the brain. So how does levels of analysis help us understand the modularity debate? It's our contention that psychology and the broader behavioral sciences have practitioners walking around who hold vastly different conceptualizations of the mind. In our experience, there are a vast number of researchers, possibly the majority of researchers, who hold a two-level of analysis view of the mind as depicted on the left. They are missing the middle functional level of analysis as depicted on the right. The crucial difference being how mechanisms are understood within the mind. For the two-level of analysis worldview on the left, mechanisms are those things that reside outside of the central agency. They're the arm and they're the memory that you can't get to, the everything else that the central agency interacts with. In contrast, on the three-level of analysis worldview, mechanisms comprise the entirety of the middle functional level of analysis. This is extremely important. So what happens is that when modularity is discussed, the two-level of analysis worldview folks insert the concept of module into the mechanism slot at the intentional level of analysis, which is defined as being the things that are not the central agency. Whereas for the three-level of analysis worldview folks, modules are everything that exists at the functional level of analysis. And so, if you haven't caught on already, the view on the left is Fodorian modularity and also Desteno et al.'s view of what evolutionary psychologists are claiming. The view on the right is the view of evolutionary psychology. Briefly, for Fodor, modules are the things in the zone outside of the central agency. That's why they have the attributes that they do. They're encapsulated. They don't have access to all the information that you have, which is why visual illusions work. You can't see the two lines as being the same length, even though you, quote unquote, know they are, which is why visual input processing is modular for Fodor. They're also automatic, which means they operate outside of your control. Bottom line, Fodorian modularity's attributes are a direct readout of the two-level of analysis worldview. This difference in levels of analysis also explains the bizarre rejection of evolutionary psychologists' claims about how evolutionary psychologists think about the mind. Let's go back to the Barrett versus Desteno back and forth. Barrett et al. Say, look, evolutionary psychologists have been explicit. Evolutionary psychology doesn't mean automaticity. Desteno et al. Say, look, we completely disagree that one can define a module without evoking some kind of automaticity. At minimum, cognitive modules that are evolved must be initiated without conscious intention. So what Barrett and al. Are saying here is that evolution applies to everything on either side of the automatic, not automatic distinction, because this is true of the functional level of analysis. It encompasses either side of the central agency, not central agency distinction. And it's at this level at which claims about evolved cognitive mechanisms are made. Desteno, in contrast, our understanding of evolved cognitive modules is being those things outside the purview of the central agency. It's the two-level of analysis worldview, which is why they're insisting evolved cognitive modules must be automatic and operate without conscious intention. They literally do not see where else to put evolved cognitive modules in their worldview of the mind. So what are some takeaways? The first is that the 2 versus 3 levels of analysis worldview distinction is a fundamental rift in the current behavioral and psychological sciences. The shift from the 2 to 3 levels of analysis view is nothing short of a Kuhnian paradigm shift. And although most researchers may explicitly agree with the 3-level view on the right, in practice, the 2-level view on the left is predominant. Point number 2 is that evolutionary psychology has been widely misunderstood because of the 2-level of analysis worldview, such that evolutionary stuff is understood as that which doesn't fall under the purview of the central agency, as we saw in the case of Desteno et al. This is why people often pit evolutionary claims against general reasoning, or logic, or consciousness. These are just superficial concepts painted onto a misunderstanding of evolutionary psychology through the lens of the intentional level of analysis. As a consequence of this, and this is important enough that we're writing out in text here, point number 3 is that saying we don't mean Fodorian modularity, or what we mean by modularity is functional specificity, is not going to be enough. When people hear terms like functionally specialized, adaptive problem specific, etc., this is all just jargon for the stuff that goes in the not the central agency slot. So what do? First is we reject the pitting of the central agency against the evolutionary stuff. We identify this as a deeper symptom of incorrectly understanding evolutionary psychology through the lens of the intentional level of analysis, and we explicitly draw out the functional versus intentional level of analysis distinction. Our recommendation at minimum would be that Fodorian modularity be referred to as intentional modularity, whereas evolutionary psychology's version of modularity be referred to as functional modularity, thereby marking the difference in levels of analysis, or better yet, jettison the term modularity altogether and say something like functional systems. Now, on a final note, there's reason to be hopeful. It may sound like we're arguing that evolutionary psychology has been uniquely hurt victim of the 2-level of analysis worldview, but we would in fact argue that all of psychology has been harmed by it. So evolutionary psychology is in a unique position to be on the vanguard in another frontier in the behavioral sciences, clarifying and distinguishing between the intentional and functional levels of analysis. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing your questions.